Okay, I'm just going to kick off. People will join as we start. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I'm Bim Afolami, chair of PRASEG, which is the APPG for renewable and sustainable energy. And people, the sort of events we typically have are talking about, nationally determined contributions at COP26, or whether nuclear energy should play a role, or wind turbines, or, green finance. And this is a really interesting and different event, but no less important, because we're going to talk about sport, climate change, and sustainability. We're going to hear from Arsenal, Wimbledon, RNA, Formula E, about the work they're doing on sustainability and why they think it's important. We're also delighted to be joined by Nigel Topping, the high-level champion for COP26. It's better to be the high-level champion than the low-level champion, I suppose, Nigel. But and he will be talking about how we're harnessing the power of sport to build momentum into COP26. And we want to hear from you. We have on this, though I haven't checked, but people who signed up, politicians, lucky you, governing bodies, major venues, athletes, Olympians on this call, sustainability experts, civil society organizations, academics. The chat and Q&A are open, so do feed stuff through, and I can already see things coming in. So please feed things through, and I think this could be a really interesting event, because I, for one, on thinking about this event, on thinking about all of this stuff, didn't think of how I didn't think of sport and sustainability immediately. And I think, and I'm quite immersed in these issues. So I'm really glad we'll be able to bring such a high quality group of people. I'm going to start by introducing Jonathan Overend. Jonathan is one of the world's leading sports broadcasters, with one of the most recognizable voices on radio, alongside stellar career covering tennis, football for BBC, the Olympics. He recently put together, and I haven't listened to this yet, but I will, I promise, the Emergency on Planet Sport podcast, with support from our friends at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. So, Jonathan, first of all, just tell us a little bit about you and how you got yourself to this place, and how you think about sustainability, and how the Emergency on Planet Sport podcast and the project indeed came about.
Bim, good morning. Thank you so much for that, and for the invitation to be part of this, and for the opportunity to have a formal shave for the first time in approximately 11 months. And good morning, everybody.
Oh my goodness.
I think the question I've been asked the most since making the series, which was released in January, as you say, Emergency on Planet Sport, it's called, available from all podcast providers, get the plug in, is, I didn't know you were an eco-warrior. I didn't know you were a climate activist. I didn't know you were a science nerd. And my response to all of those is, well, I'm not. All I am really is a journalist, and primarily a sports fan. And why is that important to this? Because I think really what the last 12 months has shown us all as sports fans is that sometimes we have to do without the things we love. And I can't watch the football team I love, and I went a period of not being able to do that. We weren't able to have Wimbledon last year, for example, and that was heartbreaking. The Open Championship, heartbreaking for me as a sports fan primarily. So this got me thinking, and it's like, okay, well, if we're reacting in this way to a global pandemic, what's going to happen if perhaps in the future climate change determines that we can't do the things we love? We can't watch the sports we love, we can't play the sports we love. Is that something we've actually given enough consideration to in the past? And I think overwhelmingly the answer to that question was no, we haven't. Because we kind of expect sport to just happen, Bim, don't we? We turn on our TV or our radio, or if we're lucky enough to have a ticket, you there, over there with your racket or your ball, just get on with it. Entertain us. It's an entertainment business. But do we really consider the conditions? Do we consider the effect of climate change if global warming continues and those trends continue? Is there breaking point? If so, who's to determine what that breaking point is and when it occurs? Who's making these decisions? These are massive, impactful issues that sport is facing, not in 20, 30 years' time, but right now.
Okay, so just on that, I mean, you've hinted at a couple of things, but where do you think the examples of climate change, the climate change risks to sport, get stuck? you know, where does the rubber hit the road, if that isn't sort of mixing various metaphors? You know, what does this look like? Because someone could listen to this and go, well, I don't really see why sport should be affected. So what does this actually look like? What does the climate change risk to the sports that we know and love?
Okay, I'll give you two very specific examples from both my experience watching sport around the world and also in making this documentary series. One is my visits to Australia over the years, to the Australian Open tennis and also to the Ashes Tour of 2017-2018. And I was at the SCG on the day that Joe Root was in hospital after batting in 46-degree temperatures. At the Australian Open tennis, again, they've had multiple years of playing in 40-degree temperatures. And this is almost impossible to compete at an elite level in. And if you consider, Bim, that at the professional events, you've got all the medical backup that you could wish. You've got the ice baths behind the scenes. You've got doctors at every turn. You've got people playing recreational sport on tennis courts in Melbourne, just round the corner from the Rod Laver Arena, who don't have any of that support. You have cricketers playing on the subcontinent in these sort of temperatures with no support. So my point would be is if global warming trends continue and those temperatures continue the way they are going, we are going to be at breaking point temperature-wise before too long. But this isn't all about heat. One of the things that really surprised us making the series was the impact on a sport such as golf. And we're going to talk to Steve at the RNA in a bit. And I went up to Montrose on the east coast of Scotland to see a beautiful golf course that's, golf's been played there for centuries. And it's literally being eaten alive by the North Sea. You know, we talk about coastal erosion, and maybe I, in my ignorance in the past, thought, oh, 0.5 metre in 5 years, coastal erosion, what's that going to mean? This is 2 metres per year. 2 metres of land is being eaten per year in Montrose. And the nature of links golf, which is where the Open Championship is staged, is that we play on coastal courses that hug the coastline. And if our coastline disappears, where are we going to play our links golf in the future?
Okay.
Very much an awareness thing.
So having depressed me, and I'm sure lots of other people, just say, what are your reasons to be hopeful on this? Because what you're sounding, it does sound a bit depressing. So yes. Why should we not be depressed?
Okay, well, this is really important, and this was something we really wanted to get across in the series, that this is not all doom and gloom. Yes, awareness is number one, the important factor here, but there is so much being done in sport, and we're going to hear a lot about what is being done from our guests in a few minutes' time. And I think the fact that we can all be more open, have these sort of conversations, make documentaries on this subject, it is a real important step forward, Bim, because I think, for one, I do not have an electric car on my driveway as I look out of my window there. Hopefully I will in the not too distant future. But I think the fact that we cannot all declare ourselves as being perfect on this issue is absolutely fundamental. We can't be scared of addressing this. Just because we take like 20 flights a year doesn't mean we can't have an opinion on this subject, and we can't have the will and the desire to make a difference. So I just think that sort of transparency, to have this conversation and all show willingness to learn and engage more on it, is the most important reason for optimism.
Well, thank you very much. And transparency and willingness to learn, in politics it'll never catch on, but in sport I'm sure it will. I just want to come to a couple of other people again, as you hinted at, Jonathan, and we'll bring you back in. But you mentioned golf. So I'm just going to ask Steve Isaac, who is Director of Sustainability at the RNA, which is the governing body for golf, which many of you, if not all of you, will know. Steve, what's going on? What are you doing to address some of the issues that Jonathan mentioned?
Right. Well, thanks, Bim, for this opportunity. Our purpose is to see golf thriving in 50 years' time. So these issues are very pertinent to that. And Jonathan's mentioned one of the issues that golf's facing immediately. Though obviously drought, water scarcity, all the climate change issues will impact the playing of golf. What we're actually doing, I want to just quickly cover a couple of things. In 2018, we initiated what we're calling Golf Course 2030. Which is a program of research, education, and communications. And the first thing this tries to do is raise awareness of the issues. I think there's a big danger in sports just walking blindfold off a cliff if we're not careful. So raising awareness, point number one. The second thing we want to do through this is to support golf to address those issues and prepare the sport for future challenges posed by climate change, but also by resource issues. There are serious related issues around resources, particularly things like water scarcity, and also regulation. Golf is being impacted by regulation, again, in relation to water, but also in terms of availability of pesticides. And that's going to be a key issue with climate change, because global warming, in many instances, will either change the weeds, pests, diseases that we see on golf courses, or it's going to increase their incidence. So if we have fewer tools in our armory to combat those problems, it could be an issue for course condition and playability. As part of that initiative, we're getting countries and regions to produce action plans to highlight the priority issues in their part of the world, but also suggest ways that they can broach them. And currently we have 9 European countries or regions with action plans, and that actually covers 92% of all golf facilities in Europe. And the key themes coming out of those: climate action. How do we cope with extreme weather? But also, how do we contribute to the cause of reducing emissions? And how can golf provide ecosystem services, which are not only going to help golf, but are going to help the rest of society? So this isn't all about preserving golf, it's what can golf bring to communities. We're looking at water issues, we're looking at sustainable options for the management of diseases, pests and weeds, and we're definitely looking at biodiversity, because that seems to be a big victim of climate change. At the moment, we've got 14 research projects underway, and included in that, we're looking at standards. What should we expect from our golf courses of the future? And we need to address golfers' expectations about what the golf course of the future is going to look like. It may look very different to what they're used to today. But also greenkeepers. We're looking to the education of greenkeepers, because at the end of the day, if we do find solutions, they're the people that are going to have to implement. So they're key to all of this. Lots of information on the R&A website about that. The other thing I'd like to touch on is the Open Championship, which Jonathan has already mentioned. And this is golf's oldest and most international major, and it's our shop window. We have a sustainable development program at the Open called Green Links, which we're taking out to our other championships. And just some highlights from that. All of our Open venues are GEO certified. I'm not sure how many people are familiar with the GEO Foundation. It's basically golf's policeman, if you like, and they have an accreditation system. Since 2016, at all our Open championships, we've achieved zero waste to landfill. We ran an open water initiative at the 148th Open at Royal Portrush in 2019, where we removed all single-use plastic bottles for water from the event. And that removed about 140 single-use plastic bottles.
Okay, so just on that, more generally, we'll come back. So we'll allow the conversation to flow a bit, because I think that golf is quite similar, or I say this is quite similar. It feels to me like it should be quite similar to what goes on at, I don't know, Wimbledon, and how you manage grass courts, because you are trying to deal with a highly manicured playing surface that is a natural playing surface. So Hattie, having listened to what Steve said about golf, do you recognise some of those things, and what different things are Wimbledon doing, and what similarities do you see?
Well, definitely recognise similarities, just that we are being affected by changing climate along with everybody else. When you talk about the grass court surface, I would probably have to call on the expertise of our groundsman rather than me, in terms of how they compare with the golf courses. But I think, at the All England Club, acting to protect the climate and environment simply aligns with our overall aims as well. And so, similar to Steve, we are looking obviously to keep Wimbledon at the kind of pinnacle of our sport, but to be a guardian of tennis and foster the strength of the game. And so protect, you know, we're obviously passionate about tennis, but we're also passionate about protecting the environment that we depend upon. And so, again, similar, we've got a 2030 environment positive aim and strategy. And for us, that's about 4 things: bringing emissions from our operations down to net zero. And we track and disclose our footprint, resource efficiency, biodiversity gain, and this idea of using our influence, because as you know, so Jonathan so sort of compellingly pointed out in the podcast series, sport is definitely experiencing climate change, but also can be a real powerful advocate for change and awareness raising. So that's a sort of key part of what we want to do at the All England Club. And just some brief examples, you know, we buy renewable electricity. That was a really easy switch for us to make. We're phasing in electric vehicles to our championship transportation fleet. But I think what's really exciting is plans about the future regeneration of our estate. We'll have some solar generation. We've got some on our community sports ground already, but a new building that's going up at the moment is going to have solar, which is great, but also looking at phasing out gas for heat as well. So ultimately eliminating dependency on gas. We've got veggie vegan options. You can get vegan cream for the Wimbledon strawberry. So lots of stuff on emissions. Resources, single-use plastic, a big thing. So following in the footsteps of lots of other sports organisations and events, but introducing reusable cups for drinks, but also looking at construction and materials. So we're going to be beginning construction on a building that can be disassembled and moved. So keeping those resources in use afterwards. Biodiversity, again, where we really align with lots of sporting events. We've got this beautiful, I mean, it's always been a feature. We present tennis in an English garden, but we had the living wall on the side of number 1 court, not just green, but planted with flowering plants to encourage pollinators. We've harvested about 10,000 acorns from veteran oaks on the Wimbledon Park golf course, so we can protect that ancient genetic material. So kind of lots of things that we're doing in education space in the grounds as well to kind of try and raise awareness. So I think, you know, all across sport, there are lots of similar examples.
Okay. That's really interesting. And Jonathan, just on golf and tennis, is there anything you want to add that you've seen or heard about that you've covered on your podcast, which, as I repeat, I will listen to?
Yes, well, I think what's really, really good to hear from both the RNA and Wimbledon is that there is so much good work being done in this space, and we didn't want it all to be doom and gloom, as you said a few minutes ago, Bim, because sport can be a leader on this, and by setting an example to its followers, to its participants, really important. You know, the athletes themselves, they can use their role as influencers. So if we as sports encourage them to change their behaviours, they can then encourage millions of people who follow them globally. So that's where sport can be a real vehicle for positive change.
Cool, thank you. So, Mike Lloyd, Sustainability and Logistics Manager for Arsenal, which is also my team. You know, and it's been a tough few months for me and the club. I hope, Mike, you're handling that okay. But on sustainability, I won't now go into Arsenal. On sustainability, Mike, what are Arsenal doing? What are you guys up to?
Yeah, thanks. So we've been doing quite a few bits in this. Good to know that you're a supporter, obviously. That's the most important thing. So we started really doing some really big things certainly around energy back in 2016. So we signed a partnership with Octopus Energy. So we became completely renewable energy powered. And that was kind of like the first step, actually kind of getting a partnership to kind of help us along our way. So that was a really interesting time for us. And then since then, we've done a few more things, certainly around energy. So in 2018, we installed a battery at Emirates Stadium. So it's quite simple. All it does is it charges up overnight with renewable energy. And then when all the wind turbines are spinning in the North Sea, we pull that into our battery, and then we can use that during peak times. So we were the first club first stadium in this country to bring something like that in. And that's really kind of seen as almost a starting point for being, more creative with our energy. Can we start to generate ourselves and feed into that battery, or what can we really use that to do, something, innovative. So then after that, kind of moving away from energy a little bit, we introduced a reusable cup, which takes 20,000 single-use plastic cups out of our waste stream, like this one here. So we introduced that with a partner, with Camden Brewery back the start of season 2019 season. So that's been a really interesting project. Again, we were part of a kind of an integrated trial with the Premier League to see how that would work. So we did some work with them and some other football clubs to see how that would work. And so we've been really pleased to be able to get that off the ground.
Mike, just one thing.
Yeah.
And I could have frankly asked anybody so far about this, but I'll ask you because, football players are, in terms of sportsmen, pretty much up there as the most famous, at least in Britain and many parts of the Western world, at least. To what extent have you tried to use that fact to highlight the thing that Jonathan was mentioning, and indeed Steve and Hattie mentioned in different ways, to use them as influencers, to use them as at the vanguard of change and highlighting. Now, part of that's PR for Arsenal, but actually more importantly, it's just, we think this is important and we show that through our players and the work the players are doing. So first of all, to what extent do you use your individual stars? And secondly, to what extent, and I'm not asking you to give away any secrets, but to what extent has there ever been resistance from anybody within the club to doing that?
Yes, so a few of our players have been kind of quite outspoken in this. I think Hector Bellerin is probably the most famous. He's very into his sort of sustainability and working, into vegan and has an electric vehicle and things like that. But what we've done, certainly with some of the projects that we've launched, we've tried to use several players to kind of, to get that message across. And then we were talking earlier just about kind of, the scope of sport, and we just some interesting numbers really on that. So we have 37 million followers on Facebook, and we also have 8.5 million people hit our website and 17 million on Twitter. So it just really kind of emphasizes, if that's just one club, the actual kind of reach that sport has. So I think it's really crucial that we're kind of having these conversations now, and people realizing that, sport isn't just for entertainment. It has a huge impact, and we can really kind of engage with our fans who obviously want to know how Arsenal did on Sunday in the North London derby. They obviously want to know that, but then they also want to know that the club is taking these things seriously and is taking, is really trying to reduce their impact.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And a lot of people have mentioned electric cars. We've got Jennifer Babington here, who's the operations director from Envision Virgin Racing, which is a Formula E team. So Jennifer, what is Formula E doing? And also, slightly provocatively, what do you think the rest of the motor industry can learn from Formula E as well?
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me. It's so interesting listening to everyone speak, I think, because you kind of get all these great ideas coming from all the different sports that we're involved in. And I suppose you might, Bim, you're right, you might look at me and think, what the heck? How is a
I would never look at you and
team?
think, what the heck? I want to be
How is a car racing team, though, that we travel around 15 different countries around the world racing in city centres? What's that got to do with anything that's green? And I suppose that's a fair cop. Some of the questions that have been popping up in the panel discussions have been, with the impact that sports have on the planet, how are we able to counteract that? And I suppose for us as a sport, and for us particularly as a team, when we all got together and really thought about what we're trying to do. We want to use the 500 million people that watch the sport around the world. For us as a team, we think going round and round and round and round in circles, may I say, like some of the other sports teams do potentially in this kind of space, that isn't good enough. We've got to be doing something else with that impact that we have on the planet. And so for a team, our whole mission is set up around promoting sustainability, energizing the transition to e-mobility. It's the space that we feel most competent to talk about, empowered by renewable energy. Our major shareholder and one of our major sponsors is a renewable energy company. So the whole mission ties together really nicely for us. And I suppose the thing that really struck me from listening to Mike just speak a moment ago is, sport's all about excitement, it's all about energy, it's about feeling good. Everyone, as soon as you mentioned Arsenal, Nigel started smiling, Bim, you were smiling. That passion that you get from being involved in a sports team really comes across. And I suppose what we're trying to do and what our mission is to capture that excitement around sports and entertainment, but do it in a guilt-free way. So as a race team, we're certified carbon neutral by the Carbon Trust. We run a sustainability program. We have, we're partnered with COP26. We're the first sports team to signed up to the United Nations Sports for Climate Action Framework. What more can we do? That's me. It's always okay every day. What's the next thing that we could be doing as a team to help highlight and show the impact that you can have, and how can you combine that, the passion and fun that we have for sports and for the racing? How do you translate that across to your fans to get them also involved and passionate about the planet in the same way that we are? And we're seeing that there's a really good mix between that, and we're starting to get lots of engagement around that. But it's constantly being challenged by everyone else, and challenging each of us other in different sports to try and come together, to kind of to race for saving the planet. That's an exciting mission to be part of.
Gosh, well, thank you. And racing for saving the planet, I think, is a very good phrase. And we've got Nigel Topping here, who is the high-level champion for COP26. And I suspect that, the difficulty with COP26 is it's this massive thing that it's quite hard for everybody to get their arms around, as, exactly who's doing what and what's going on. So it would be great if Nigel would, first of all, just explain exactly what a high-level champion for COP26 does, and what your reflections are on what you've heard, and the role you think sport can play, and the role you think sport how you think maybe sport needs to improve and do different things as well. So over to you.
Well, thanks, Bim, and thanks for inviting me. It was just really enjoyable. I spend a lot of my time worrying about how we decarbonize cement or steel. So this is I love the energy around this topic here. Yeah, let me explain my role. So the role I hold is I'm appointed by the UK Prime Minister as part of the responsibilities of the UK government in taking on the presidency of COP26. But the role I hold was created by all the countries who created the Paris Agreement 5 years ago, and they said, yes, this is an agreement between national governments, but we need somebody whose job is just to work with everybody else, what they call non-state actors, which basically means businesses, investors, cities, states and regions, sports clubs, sports associations, universities, everybody. So first thing says, this is like, a dream conversation for me to be in, because you're all doing the really hard work of transforming your organizations, which are all complex. And I think most excitingly, Bim, bringing the fan base with you. I have a fancy title of high-level champion for climate action, but I don't have the reach of one of your drivers or one of your golf players or one of your or one football team. Right? The thing I love about sport, having been a quite serious rugby player in my youth, is it's so competitive. So I hear it here, 37 million from Arsenal, but then Jennifer trumps it with 500 million million watchers. So that for me is the really exciting thing, is the way that this combination of the practical work that you're all doing to transform your own organizations, that's a credibility issue, right? So Mike, your battery, right? It's part of a learning process that actually, the fact that the wind doesn't blow all the time and the sun doesn't shine all the time can be overcome with this incredible technology called batteries, and it means you can actually save money as a club, right? So I think the practical work, all the work that and the partnerships that you're engaging in is really exciting. But most exciting for me is the way that then leverages for these tens of millions, hundreds of millions of fans. I know, Jennifer, that Christiana Figueres, who's a dear friend, is on the advisory board of Formula E, and actually I just did a podcast with her the other day because Extreme E, who I guess are kind of fellow travelers in terms of electrifying motorsport with you, are just today launching their sort of citizen engagement or their fan mobilization initiative in partnership with Count Us In, which is a big partnership that we've been very involved in. So and several of you I know are already in the UN Sports for Climate Action. I think Jennifer, you mentioned it, and Mike too, and maybe some others. I can't keep up with everything. So my job is basically to drive this race that we call the Race to Zero. Actually, one of the things I'm most excited about is that we've got a little Race to Zero logo on all the Extreme E drivers' uniforms. So if anybody else wants to follow that, we could have a lot more people knowing that this is a race that we're both all in together, and it needs us all in. But we can also have some fun in the race in the amazing way that sport motivates that. A little example: my university, Cambridge, committed to net zero 2038. Guess what? Oxford's just committed to beat that by a few years. Just the same way that the UK says 2050, so Scotland says 2045. Scotland says it's going to phase out combustion engines 2032. England says 2030. You have this kind of constructive race to the top. I think is one of the most exciting things, and it's this leading by example, and then using your iconic status and that of the superstars who have individually tens of millions to help individuals normalize taking actions which may be changed. I go back to what Jonathan said at the beginning, is that we don't need to make this about everybody feeling bad about everything that they do. It's not a good way of motivating people, but to give people examples of how they can change and feel part of a movement. And sport, above all, has this feeling of being a movement where we come together around our teams, around our heroes. And there's no race more important for sport, for our health, and for the planet than this Race to Zero. So I think it's really exciting to hear the way that you're mobilizing using your unique assets, which will always attract more interest than the equally important but rather less emotionally appealing work of decarbonising cement and steel, which I also have to get involved in.
Well, Nigel, I think you're doing yourself a disservice. I personally think that decarbonising cement is hugely interesting and can attract millions of followers on Facebook and Twitter. And I don't know what you're talking about, but my role and our role at PRASEG, we are the sort of parliamentary liaison working with Alok and his team in the COP26 sort of unit and coordinating the parliamentary activity around it. How can we help you, not just in this sport, but more broadly, and with a sport, so it's sort of more broadly, and then secondly, with a sort of sport hat on, I'm now flipping from being somebody who said, don't be doom and gloom, to now being slightly doom and gloomy. It's always great when we can have very positive conversations about what everybody's doing, and everybody always thinks that they're doing a great job in their organizations because they are working very hard and they're doing all the things they want to do and they think need doing. But what do you think are the things that haven't really been touched that are going to need to be touched in sport as well? So firstly, how can we help you on the parliamentary side, and then specifically on sport, what are the things that you haven't heard that you think, you know what, in the next few years, we're really going to have to start thinking of X, we're really going to have to start thinking of Y?
Well, I mean, on the parliamentary side, I actually think that, if you like, Team UK's got its act together really well around the COP, and that on the parliamentary side, just encouraging every entity to join this Race to Zero. So that's a rigorous way of not only committing to getting to zero by 2050 at the latest. And one of the exciting things about the race is that increasingly we're seeing 2045, 2040, Mercedes and Unilever both chose 2039 just to kind of prove the point that they're doing it earlier than people are saying 2040. So again, that and encouraging everybody to join the Race to Zero. And that's something, I mean, I was just on a meeting with Alok and about 20 CEOs yesterday who are all in the race, and they're all taking on their own challenge to bring, the rest of their sector along. So one thing, so I would say on a parliamentary point of view, keeping the scrutiny of the domestic policy agenda, because that's credibility. And again, I think, I was in Kenya 2 weeks ago speaking to civil society. The first thing they wanted to talk to me about was the UK's Cumbria coal mine, right? So, for example, the decision to bring that in will be seen by people all around the world as something which adds to UK credibility rather than detracting from it. So, hold it, using the parliamentary voice to push for domestic policy, but then more broadly, just get everybody in this race, right? As we say, it's something we can only win if every university, every sports club. And then I think we can start to have some fun on the sports side. I think that there's some momentum building to create, and Mike might know more about this, but my colleagues who are working on the Count Us In campaign, exploring whether we might end up with a carbon league for the Premier League. So which clubs are doing best on decarbonising and on mobilising their fan base. What's missing, Bim? So what we tend to focus on a lot is the work which is getting easier about really accelerating change on power and transport. So it's great. Nearly everybody's talked about the partnerships or switching to renewable energy and moving to electric vehicles, which is great. And I think most excitingly, they're happening much faster than people ever thought. I mean, I used to work in the automotive sector in manufacturing, and I've been obsessing for a long time around how change actually happens. And this fact that 5 years ago, the International Energy Agency thought we'd still be buying a lot of combustion engines in the 2080s. And now the whole industry knows the combustion engine is toast. It's a museum piece within 10 years, right? So things can happen much faster, and we should focus on that exponential change and the work that these sports organizations are doing about, if you like, normalizing that change. So it's something that ordinary sports fans hear about when they go to Wimbledon. They see, I love the idea of your rebuildable building, for example, right? Or they hear from racing drivers, all right. So the idea is really the idea of a petrol head. I think is becoming. They're going to be like the people with the Lancastrians with flat caps going to steamroller fairs, right? That I see when I used to run a factory in Manchester in the 90s, right? So we're seeing a real cultural shift. I think the things that we need to pay a lot more attention to are actually the cement and the diet. It's the materials that we build with, so cement and steel. So actually, interesting, Bim. I was sort of joking a bit about how serious that when we partnered with TED on the Countdown initiative last October. I had 3 hours of programming listened to by 15 million people, which is quite a lot for climate change. Maybe not for a Formula E race or for Wimbledon, but it's a lot for climate change, right? And partly because we brought in cultural icons like Bollywood stars and pop stars, not just climate scientists and CEOs, right? So we made it more multicultural. The two talks on the innovation in the cement industry actually were the ones that generated a lot of the interest, because something that was seen to be boring actually suddenly is portrayed as something where there's exciting, innovative stuff. And I think that we don't make enough of this as an exciting journey of innovation, and we don't back ourselves enough. And everything that I'm hearing from everybody here is one of innovating. So the things that you're doing in Wimbledon around diet, and the things that all of you are doing around construction actually really matter, because those are the next waves, right? The decarbonising of materials and the reduction in the carbon footprint of our diet, both of which are about a quarter of the problem. So if we don't tackle those, we won't get to zero.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Nigel. That's really, really interesting. I'm going to bring in Claire Poole and Claire Poole is the Chief Executive of the Sport Positive Summit, who works closely with the UNFCCC on their Sport for Climate Action framework. So Claire, can you explain to everybody what the Sport Positive Summit is and what you're up to?
Yeah, absolutely. So the summit is the annual gathering of sort of all the actors in the sport and climate space globally to come together and progress this. So we come together once a year virtually at the minute on that. But more broadly, we support the UN Sports for Climate Action framework, which is now up to 214 global signatories. A lot of whom are on the call here and attending as well. So yeah, essentially our remit is to just try and connect and progress increased ambition around climate change in sport, and fascinating to hear what everyone's talking about, because we've also in 2019 launched the Sport Positive Premier League sustainability table. We're rolling out with Bundesliga, La Liga and other football leagues globally. So again, that idea of ranking environmental sustainability metrics across football to start off with, but also other sports to follow, and using the competition element of football basically to rank that. So lots of different work streams going on, Bitten.
Very interesting. And what's your, I'm putting you on the spot, but you know, when I think of sort of a carbon league or something like that, and obviously it's something that Nigel mentioned, the difficulty will be understanding how long to flow through your carbon. Say, for example, you're buying chicken for the match day lunch. Well, is it just the chicken, or is it the machines that help deal with the transport the chicken? Like, do you see what I mean? I mean, how far back do you do it? How are you thinking of doing that?
So the way we've done it, because we've gone through the sort of motions of this, we started off trying to look at carbon footprinting, but as you said, it's so difficult. If you take it to the nth degree, you could be looking at how people are consuming sports matches or sports tournaments. Are they watching online or on TVs? What's the carbon footprint of that? So that gets really, really tricky. So what we instead decided to do was look at how clubs, you know, the big ways emissions are happening through energy, transport, food, also on the communication and fan engagement side, how far organisations are reaching that sort of golden egg of changing fans' behaviours and really pushing that out more broadly. So we decided to go down the sustainability metrics side to what we could actually grasp. There's definitely growth there. We want to build into biodiversity and, you know, club sponsorship and, you know, try and get further out to that as well. But just to tie into your point as well, one of the biggest issues we see with sport in terms of this work is the Scope 3 fan travel element of it. So a lot of sports organisations, obviously within Scope 1 and 2, they're direct emissions. They are, so many clubs and sports organisations are really, really far along with that. What's more difficult is when fans, of course, travel to games, to tournaments, to matches. You know, going forward, how we can try and connect with public transport providers, ensure that active transport's available, carpooling, and other options rather than people travelling to games, tournaments through vehicles, basically their own private cars and vehicles. So I see that as a big nut to crack in terms of sport.
Great, thank you. And I've just seen something's come in on the chat with Phil Horton telling me that Mike Berners-Lee written the book How Bad Are Bananas, which will tell me about chicken. So thank you, Phil. I'm not obsessed with chicken. I just mentioned it off the top. Everybody's going to think I'm some like chicken obsessive. Anyway, thank you, Claire. Dr. Russell Seymour, who's the Chief Executive of the British Association for Sustainable Sport, which I'm hoping does what it says on the tin. Russell, what are you up to?
Well, look, you've just summarised it. It absolutely does what it says on the tin. What we try and do is draw together all of the actors here. Most of the people on this call either are associated with us or are actually on our board. For example, Mike and Hattie have both been long-serving members of the BASIS board and contribute a huge amount to what we do. But really, BASIS is all about bringing these ideas together. We've existed for about 10 years. We've created a very good network of some of the most experienced operational managers at UK sports venues, but we also reach into recreational sport, and we try to influence the way that people consume sports in terms of their own participation. And can we get some of these sustainability ideas into local clubs, because that's kind of the volume. It's great that we have the bigger clubs doing this and putting information out there, because frankly, with you know, if a sports club talks about this, the passion and the love that people have for their club, they're going to pay more attention to it than, with apologies, than if a politician stands up and starts talking about carbon footprints. Thanks
for that, Russell. It's fine.
There's just that connection. I hope you understand what I mean, Bim, but there's just that connection to sport and participating in sport and consuming and spectating sport. So it's this massive opportunity, and that's what we're trying to embrace.
So that is a really good point. And I think the passion and frankly, the followership that sports gets, not per se for the individuals, weirdly. I often think people mischaracterize it. People come out, they're obsessed with individual sportsmen. They're not, they're obsessed with the way how that person may play the game. And that's what really attracts people. Jonathan, seeing as you came to this, you know, as an individual who loves sport, as you mentioned, I'm just going to bring up a question that came in the chat. about sort of individuals and engaging in citizens or fans to an individual path to a net zero lifestyle. So I'm just wondering, Jonathan, if you have thought about that, or how you see the role of the individual as playing a part.
Yeah, I think one of the strap lines, if you like, on the series that we made was that this is about all of us, and it's for all of us, but it's also on all of us. You know, we all have to play a part as individual citizens. Yes, it's about global governments and global corporations and big hitters in the world of commerce, but it's also about us as individuals. We may not be able to change the world, but by having this conversation and all being engaged and making changes in our own personal lives, we can influence others. And if I may, if I could go back to what Nigel and Claire were talking about in terms of the competition element, I think it's really important. And wasn't it great on Sky Sports, who themselves are doing a lot of good work in this area ahead of the North London Derby, to see an actual feature on this involving Premier League players? If you haven't seen it, you can check it out on YouTube. It involved Bukayo Saka for Arsenal and Eric Dyer for Tottenham, and they were having a really fun quiz almost about their club's sustainability goals. And I thought, brilliant, that's exactly what we need, because yes, on one hand, we're discussing this topic. On the second point, we're involving people with millions of followers. And then crucially, as Nigel touched on this, they were having fun. And if I ever get around to making a second series of the podcast, which I really hope I will do, I want us to have some fun with it, because this conversation sometimes can come across to people who aren't engaged as a bit earnest, and it's not really. And if we can liven it up, and if we can have some fun around these issues, I love the Race to Zero thing. That's great. We can all be involved in that. Then I think we can take this conversation on to the next level.
Great, thank you. Nigel, if I might just ask you a political question, not a party political question, but a broader political question about the role of different countries. So I think it's fair to say that you've probably got three groups of countries in the world on this subject. You have countries that are fully engaged in it, their governments or parliaments are engaged in this subject, and they want to try and do the best, thing on it, and it's a big priority. You then have countries which recognize it to be important, but it's not quite at the level of priority, but they do, you can see them getting there. And then you've got a third group of countries who frankly see this as largely a sort of Western European thing, which designed to sort of stop them developing, and they will develop in the way that the Western countries did. And they may pay lip service just to make things a bit easier, but they're not really engaging. Bearing that in mind, what's your sense, for example, about sports events that may take place? Because sports events by nature have to go around the world. The Olympics has to go around the world. It's very important these things are global. That may take place in countries where, this is not a subject of importance. What would you say for those who say, and I'm not one of them, but there are many who would say, well, actually, we should regard that as how people used to look at apartheid South Africa, or we should look at that as, if you're not taking this seriously, we shouldn't put events in your country. What's your sense of that with your international experience and the number of people you speak to all over the world on this subject?
Yeah, interesting. I was just thinking of my experience just literally 2 weeks ago in Kenya, where I was 1 minute talking to the Treasury and the central bank around how can we mobilize more green finance, and then I was in slums with organizations trying to address the kind of ecological justice issues, the fact that people have no water and no clean spaces, and in the slums people are wearing Arsenal shirts and Barcelona shirts, right? So just first thought is that to recognize that sport has a really global influence, right? I mean, you can go into any slum in the world and you will find international sports clubs, and on the buses you'll find sort of graffiti with pictures of great cricketers or great tennis players. I think so I prefer to focus on the positive. I think I don't think, I mean, if there's anything, the apartheid's a big word, right? And it evokes kind of shocking images and a time, and the way in which apartheid occasionally gets used in the climate space is the risk of climate apartheid, where the global north decarbonizes by getting Teslas, and the global south decarbonizes by going back into extreme poverty, right? So you can, there's two ways of having it.
By the way, I use that word deliberately because I have heard it used in context, and I wanted to use that word quite deliberately.
So I do think that this does put pressure on international. I mean, you're already, the Olympics is, there's huge pressure on an organization like the Olympics to demonstrate that it is moving with the times and it is greening. You see this with the COP itself in the UK, right, as an extreme example, that being very careful about which organizations are allowed to be sponsors, right? So we've worked very carefully to make sure that, only companies who themselves are committed to the race to zero can be associated with COP. It's not just who can, and the same thing's happening with sporting events. So I think you start to see that kind of, I haven't heard anybody talk about not allowing an event to go on somewhere. But, and of course, the political environment has changed a lot with the Biden administration coming in, but for example, Australia, right, has become something of a climate pariah under recent administrations at the national level, right? Whereas cities and businesses and all the states in Australia can all be in. So it's also important to distinguish between what the sort of federal government and the non-federal government. So I think that pressure is there, and sport helps ramp up the pressure. Maybe not in a formal kind of ban or a boycott, but just in a sort of general background noise that it's not acceptable to not be in the race, as it were.
Great.
Bim, may I actually put a question to you at this juncture? Because I think it's quite interesting the way you introduced that to Nigel. You said the Olympics has to go around the world. It's got to go around because it's global. And you and your government and your bosses have had to make really big decisions over the past year because of a situation that's been kind of brought upon us. And I think the point that a lot of people have made in making this series that I've been speaking to will make the point that the potential impact of climate change in the long term dwarfs, sadly, what we've experienced with COVID. So when we're talking about making big decisions, maybe we need to think and adapt in the way that we've had to during the pandemic, and maybe that stretches to some of our preconceived ideas about the way the world operates and the way sport operates. Does the Olympic Games have to go around the world, or will it always only go to those who can afford to have it and then cause this sort of environmental destruction every 4 years? I don't know. Is that a topic we'd even dare put forward 12 months ago? I think that's where it's now at a very interesting point, this conversation, because I think maybe we should be having these broader conversations about the future.
It's a good point. My personal view is that when you have a global problem, it is not sustainable for certain parts of the world to effectively say to the other part, you're not, we're doing the right thing, you're doing the wrong thing. So if the part of the world that is doing the wrong thing at any particular point or any particular country, there needs to be partnership. And frankly, a lot of this is going to come to money in terms of, if you've got a poor country, they say, well, how are we going to be able to afford to do X or Y? Then that's where the rich world is going to have to stump up funds and have to help in quite an active way. When it comes to sport, I think this is really difficult because I'm boring enough to be obsessed with the Olympics over years and years and years and years and years. And if you actually look at how much it costs to put on the Olympics, the growth in how much it costs every year is just so insane. Like you can't even get your head around it. And it's actually becoming harder and harder for poorer countries to actually be able to afford to do it. And if they are going to do it, the nature of how they would do it would be different, etc. And of course, a lot of the technologies and the things we're doing around climate increases in the short term the financial cost of doing certain things when it might be cheaper to, run a old diesel engine for all your transport for your athletes, right? Now, in the modern Olympics, we'd expect to see electric vehicles, for example, or hydrogen vehicles. So I think that my personal view is you have to make sure that these things are kept as inclusive and as global as possible, because if you don't, I think you end up in quite a difficult geopolitical scenario with And it also happens to be the case, to make the point very starkly, that a lot of the countries that are more advanced tend to be whiter, and a lot of the countries that aren't, that are poorer, tend to be darker. And there is just a very uncomfortable dynamic that I think sport has always played quite a successful role in bridging and bringing people together in that sense. And I wouldn't want to see that upset. But I've just got one last point that came from Katie Cross, where she asked, I'm going to ask this to Mike from Arsenal, and how much of an issue has the need to be perfect that you mentioned been a barrier in players engaging with this subject? And if anybody else would like to come in on that as well. But Mike, how do you see that?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult, isn't it? Because the last thing you want to do is stand up and say this is really important when you maybe don't know an awful lot about it. So I think when we first started with working with Russell at Basis, the big driver there is a bit of sort of safety in numbers, that we can all stand up and tell our stories together. We fly all around Europe for games. We fly internally. We have quite a substantial carbon footprint. So there's always a little bit of fear that it's easy to say, whatever we stand up and say we've done that's positive, it's easy for someone to come back and say, oh yeah, but you do this and you do that. So it's really important that there's a kind of a safe forum for people to stand and go, yeah, we know we're not perfect. We know there's a lot more we can do, but I think it's the commitment to doing it that is the key. It's easy to stand aside and go, well, I'm a bit scared, I don't want to do it. But what we're actually doing now is saying, well, actually, we have done some good things. We are going to do some more things, and we've shown quite, some great projects already. But also an intent to follow that through. Signing up to the UN, and working closely with Russell and with Claire, and really kind of to make sure that we accept our frailties, but we're actually prepared to kind of take them on. And yes, we will get negative press, but hopefully the positivity will outweigh that.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks to everybody. Our hour is up, and I know that you'll have another 15 webinars to do today, so I don't want to run you over time. I just want to say I really, really enjoyed this. I've really, really, really enjoyed this, and I hope everybody else has as well. It's just been such an interesting conversation. So many things have stemmed from it. I can just see Melissa Wilson, who's mentioned that she's a current British athlete and thinks that leadership, progressive sustainability action taken by clubs, national teams and international governing bodies can act as a barrier to criticism about individual athletes being hypocrites. So please, organisations, keep doing what you're doing. And thank you, Melissa, for being a GB athlete, and best of luck at the Olympics if you're going and with all that you're doing. So thank you, everybody. Really enjoyed it. Thanks all the panelists for their words of wisdom. I expect free tickets to Arsenal, Wimbledon, the Open, and Formula E. They can be in the post at Parliament. That's fine. Thanks very much. And look, really, really, really enjoyed it. So thank you all for joining.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone.